Good evening. We are all here tonight to discuss a very complex issue, but for a very simple reason. More than any bilateral relationship that the United States has, our relations with China will determine our future, the future of our children, and the future for generations of Americans to come. Despite its critical importance, this relationship is too little understood. We are gathered this evening in town halls across America to discuss US-China relations and its impact on you. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on US-China Relations. We are co-hosting these 30 programs with local organizations in Rogers, Arkansas, Buffalo, Boston, Mountain View, California, Chicago, Queens, New York, Everett, Washington, Dayton, Denver, Honolulu, Las Vegas, Nashua, New Hampshire, Portland, Oregon, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Atlanta, Tulsa, Houston, Montpelier, Vermont, Wichita, Charlotte, Columbia, South Carolina, Phoenix, Hartford, Louisville, New Orleans, Peoria, and Philadelphia. I want to thank our local host organizations who've helped us arrange this. I want to thank our speakers who have traveled all over the country to be near you in your homes. And I want to thank all of you for coming. This half hour of tonight's program comes to you from Washington, D.C. I am seated with Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Tom Christiansen, one of the administration's most senior officials on China. Tom is also one of America's outstanding China experts, on leave from Princeton University and on leave from the National Committee's Board of Directors. He has been Deputy Assistant Secretary of State since July of last year. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Tom. Thank you so much for being here. And you will speak for about 10 minutes. Then we will take questions emailed to us from around the country.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thanks to the National Committee on US-China Relations. It's a really fine organization. As Steve said, I had the privilege to serve on the board and the executive committee of the National Committee. And I know the committee is really lucky to have Steve at the helm and to have leadership from his deputy, Jan Barris, as well. They are a terrific pair, and the organization is extremely well run. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to so many people in the United States in various locations, and I appreciate your spending the time to come out and to listen to me speak about this important topic, which is our relationship with China. As President Bush and Secretary Rice have said on several occasions, we seek, quote, a candid, cooperative, and constructive relationship with China. In that process, we're encouraging China to play a more active and responsible role in supporting the international system from which we all benefit, and from which China itself has benefited greatly, particularly in the reform era. We do this in a large series of security and economic dialogues, including most prominently the Senior Dialogue, which is run by the State Department on Security Affairs, and it's led by Deputy Secretary John Negroponte. There's also the Strategic Economic Dialogue led by Treasury Secretary Paulson, which deals with economic affairs. There are some common themes in the many dialogues we engage with the Chinese on, and I'll just list a few here. First, we're searching for common ground with the Chinese. We don't view US-China relations as a zero-sum game, and that's a theme that I'll return to later in my talk. Second, we're not asking China to do us favors. When we present ideas to China, we believe that those ideas will assist China in stabilizing themselves economically and politically and socially at home, and that while these ideas serve US interests, they will also make China's future brighter for the Chinese people. So again, we don't see these relations as a zero-sum game, and we're not trying to get China to adopt policies that are merely good for the United States. Third, our dialogues deal with much more than just the bilateral relationship, and I think this is one of the more innovative aspects of these dialogues. We talk not just about how to improve US-China relations, but how to improve US-China cooperation in dealing with problems in third areas of the world, whether they be in Northeast Asia, like on the Korean Peninsula with the nuclear issue, or whether they be in the Middle East or in Africa. I'd like to talk a little bit about the progress that we've made and some of the challenges that we face in our dialogue and our relations with China. First, I'll talk about security and political affairs. I'll give 3 examples. North Korea, we believe, on the North Korean nuclear issue, we believe we've made real progress with the Chinese in our cooperation. We have deep cooperation in the 6-party talks process. We've worked closely with the Chinese in drafting almost all of the most important documents related to the 6-party talks process, including the September 19, 2005 joint statement and the February 13, 2007 initial action plan. We've also participated with China in the UN Security Council to pass UN Security Council resolutions that raise concrete measures against the North Korean state for failing to abide by the demands of the international community. I've been a China specialist most of my adult life, and I think several years ago it would be very hard to imagine this type of coordination between the United States and China on such an important issue related to a long-term ally of the Chinese state. A second issue I'd like to discuss is Sudan. On Sudan, we certainly need China to use its very significant influence with Khartoum and with the Bashir government to accept a robust hybrid United Nations Africa Union peacekeeping force there in accord with the 3-phase plan of the United Nations. We are not at all pleased with where we are with China on this issue, and we think that China can do a lot more to persuade Bashir's government to get that UN force in to help the people of Darfur. But I should say that we have seen some real positive movement in Chinese foreign policy in recent months on this score as well. Permanent representative to the United Nations Wang Guangya has been instrumental in convincing Bashir's government to sign on to the 3-phase plan in November 2006 at the Addis Ababa meeting. More recently, China has been instrumental in convincing Khartoum to allow the 2nd phase to be implemented, and China has gone further still and has agreed to send 275 engineering forces as part of the heavy support package, which is part of that 2nd phase plan. We think these are very positive steps on China's part. We still think China needs to do more. We're not satisfied with where China is on this issue, but we think that if we continue to work with the Chinese and we continue to address this very important issue, we should be able to make further progress in getting that force into Sudan to help those people. In Iran, we have bigger challenges. We remain concerned that China sends mixed signals to the Iranian regime at a time the Iranian regime is developing its highly enriched uranium production capability. And we believe that some of the reported energy deals that are being sought by the Chinese government run counter to the international community's goals in this score. On the other hand, China has signed on to UN Security Council resolutions that put pressure on the Iranian regime to comply with the international community's demands, and we see this as a positive step on China's part. And we'll continue to work with the Chinese to seek what we both claim to be our goal, which is to have the Iranian regime cease its uranium enrichment production. And economic dialogues, many of you have read about the Strategic Economic Dialogue, the second round of which just ended here in Washington. And I'll say that we have a lot of economic dialogues with China, and I think that there are too many of them to list here. But I wanted to say something about the general record of our engagement with China on these economic affairs. And I think you do read about some of the problems in the press, and there are some real problems that I'll refer to in a moment. But there are also some success stories. Since China acceded to the WTO in 2001, trade with China has grown, or exports to China have grown 5 times faster than our exports to the rest of the world. Just last year, in 2006, exports to China rose 32%. This is compared to a growth of 18% in imports. So there are some good stories to be told in our engagement with China, and we believe that the U.S.-China economic relationship can provide good opportunities for both countries and good opportunities for American producers and workers here at home. There are, however, some real economic imbalances, and we seek to address those economic imbalances in our dialogue. There's a need for greater market flexibility in China's currency. On that score, we have seen some motion in China. There's been 8% revaluation of the Chinese currency since 2005, but we believe that China can do more and needs to move faster on these issues. A second issue is that we believe that China needs to enforce intellectual property rights in a much more robust fashion than it has, and to allow greater international access to its financial markets. When we raise those issues with China, we raise them in the spirit of saying this is good for the Chinese economy moving forward. If China wants to have an innovative economy, if it wants to have robust financial markets, it's going to need to have more competition and fair competition in those sectors. Finally, we believe that China's economic growth needs to be based more firmly on domestic demand. And we believe that this is good for the stability of China's economy moving forward, and we believe that this is good for U.S. exporters and producers as well. Another area where we cooperate with the Chinese is on energy and the environment. The President today announced a new initiative, international initiative on global warming, and we engage the Chinese very robustly on these issues in various fora, multilateral fora in the region, and China will be included in this new initiative launched by the President. This is important because, as many of you know, China is predicted to become the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the near future, and previous international efforts like Kyoto did not include the Chinese. There are some real problems in our relationship. Then when we face those problems, we're willing to use whatever methods we can find to try to convince the Chinese to change their behavior. And some of those issues that we find real problems on, and we don't have such a happy story, is on human rights and religious freedom. We raise individual cases of human rights and religious freedom abuses, and we raise systemic problems that we see in the Chinese system with the Chinese on a regular basis. In all of our dialogues, we raise these issues, and we take them extremely seriously. There's the issue of military modernization. China has a very fast-paced military modernization underway for the last several years. We are concerned not just about the pace of that modernization, but also about the lack of transparency in the military modernization program. We want to engage the Chinese more robustly and get to learn more about what their goals are in this military modernization program, what doctrinal shifts may be going on, and the ASAT test in January of 2007 underscores the problems with the lack of transparency and the alarm that some of China's actions can cause in the region and around the world when they take actions like the ASAT test without explanation or without previous warning. We particularly remain concerned about the fast-paced military modernization, the fast-paced military buildup across from Taiwan, which we consider a force for instability in cross-strait relations between Taiwan and the mainland. We maintain steadfastly our One China policy, which we believe has been a major force for stability in cross-strait relations at a time when there are a lot of factors that could challenge cross-strait stability in the last several years, both factors in the domestic political trends in Taiwan and the aforementioned buildup on the mainland, which we consider a force for instability in cross-strait relations. And I think there's a lot to cover, but I think that's as much as I should say now, and I should open up to questions. Thanks again.
Tom, you have stayed to your commitment for 10 minutes. That's perfect. And it's a wonderful overview of where we are on U.S.-China relations. We've already received a few dozen questions, so let me start and ask. The first one is from Peoria, Illinois, John Sheezer. Describe how the U.S. may react to the growth of labor unions that are actually able to succeed in gaining better wages for the Chinese worker.
Well, we support free association in China, and we support the right of Chinese workers to form into labor unions. So that would be something that we would support in all of our dialogues. We believe that they have the right to organize, and we believe that any effort by the government to prevent legal organization by the Chinese people in any form, including in the labor front, would be is unwelcome, and we believe it's not in China's own interest to suppress those types of activities.
This one from Carl Bushman from Chicago. What are the implications of the new Pentagon report on U.S.-China relations?
We don't believe that there are any significant implications of the Pentagon report on PLA military power on U.S.-China relations. The report is mandated by Congress. The Pentagon publishes this report. It's an analytic piece about trends in China's military modernization, and it doesn't constitute a change in U.S. policy toward China in any aspect that I can see, having read the report quite carefully.
Anon from Dayton. While more and more Chinese come and live in the United States and more Americans live in China, the economic ties between the two countries are greater and greater, and there will never be a war between the countries. Why is there still military competition going on? That's from Anon in Dayton.
Well, you'd have to accept the idea that we can be quite certain that there could never be a conflict between the two sides. You'd also have to accept the notion that the two countries developed their military solely for the purpose of potential confrontation between the United States and China. And I don't think either premise it holds. We certainly don't expect a military conflict with China. We think it's avoidable. We think it's not in the interest of either country. But we need to stay prepared for contingencies in international politics for which we can't be certain. So we maintain military capabilities for a wide range of contingencies where we're required by the Taiwan Relations Act to maintain capabilities to assist in Taiwan's defense if the president were so to choose. We take that commitment seriously. But we don't design our military strategy, it's my impression, we don't design our military strategy with a focus on China. We have global responsibilities. Our East Asia deployments are part of those global responsibilities. And I don't think China develops its own military with the United States solely in mind as a target. So I think the premise of the question is a little bit off, so it's a very difficult one to answer. We need to work hard to have good relations with China moving forward so that it never comes to a situation where we have a military confrontation. We're confident that we can manage our relations in that way, and I believe many people in Beijing are also confident that they can manage the relationship in that way. So although we maintain military forces, we're quite hopeful that they will never be used in a military conflict with China.
This is from St. Louis, Anita Louise Poole. The CEO of Starbucks recently said that it is difficult doing business in China because nothing is as it seems. Could you speculate as to what he may have meant by that? By the way, having been in Beijing, there are more Starbucks than there are in Washington, but okay.
Okay, I should probably give that question to you. I've never done business in China, and I know that Steve is a much more experienced business person than myself. But I think that there is a challenge for business people in China. They need to understand the local conditions, which are often very different from the local conditions that they enjoy at home. And in many cases, Chinese regulations and other conditions for business in China are not fully transparent. And that's something that I think many people in China, reformists in their own government, realize. And they would like to make the business conditions in China more transparent so that foreign investors maybe don't feel so confused there. That would be something that would be good for the foreign investor, and it would be good for China. And I just wanted to return to that point. It gives me an opportunity to do that. That in our dialogues with China, we're raising points in that spirit. When Secretary Paulson tells them that they need to increase the transparency in their economy, in their financial sector, in their regulatory sector, when they need to enforce intellectual property rights. The argument is that this isn't a favor to us, this is a favor to you yourselves, because if you want to have a stable, innovative economy moving forward, you're going to have to adopt these measures. And there's a lot of examples from world history, and you have someone like Secretary Paulson with so much experience in the international marketplace who can help convey some of those messages to what seemed to me, having engaged in these dialogues, to be a rather receptive Chinese audience when we think long-term about their economic future. They seem to understand some of the challenges they face and some of the measures that they're going to have to raise over time.
David Randolph from Tulsa. Has the recent WTO complaint filed by the U.S. against China for alleged IP violations negatively affected other diplomatic fronts, such as currency, North Korea, counterterrorism?
I don't think it should. I mean, that's a question that really you would want to ask the Chinese how they react to the WTO case. But I can tell you what we say to the Chinese when we discuss the WTO case, which is this is a sign of a mature economic relationship. It's a sign of a China that's maturing and entering into the international the environment of international organizations in a robust way. And we raise WTO cases against some of our closest partners in the world. In many ways, you could say that there's a positive correlation between the number of WTO cases that the United States raises with an economy and how close the economic relations are. Because when you have very close economic relations, you run into some friction points. And the WTO is designed to handle those friction points in a legalistic, legal manner that is smooth and peaceful. So the fact that we raise WTO cases against China on IPR issues shows that we're concerned about those issues. But using the WTO as a lever is not a sign of hostility toward China or animosity towards China. It's a sign of a maturity of the U.S.-China relationship. We see it in that light. We don't think it should affect those other issues in any way, and I don't believe they will over time.
Though the Chinese were rather vehement in their criticism of the United States for that. And you run up, as a Chinese expert, you know that runs up against a Chinese resistance to formal dispute resolution, that when you have disputes with the Chinese, they are not nearly as legalistic as we are, and they're always trying to avoid the formalistic, the legal dispute resolution, that they have mediation before they have a court case. They have mediation before they have arbitration.
Well, these are complaints in the WTO, and they are mediated in a fairly formal process. I do think this is maybe just a learning process for China, that China's been in the WTO since 2001. It's been a major economic player in the international marketplace for a relatively short period of time compared to the United States and other actors. And I guess you could apply cultural analyses, but it could also be a question of experience. And I think as China becomes more engaged with these international institutions, understands how they work, understands that they can work for everybody's advantage, including China's advantage, that they may become more comfortable with those organizations over time. And we're quite hopeful that despite some of the potential cultural hurdles that you raise, that China will become much more comfortable with these processes and work quite well in the WTO.
Assistant Secretary Hill is on his way back from Beijing, having, I guess, participated again in the six-party talks. This question comes from Kristen from Buffalo. Mm-hmm. Are China and South Korea becoming closer as a result of their common interests in dealing with North Korea? And if so, might that pose problems for the United States?
Okay, I just want to say my boss, Ambassador Hill, he's returning from Beijing, but not from the six-party talks. There was a discussion in Beijing about the six-party talks, but there wasn't a formal
six-party
It wasn't a formal round of the six-party talks. I believe he engaged on that issue and other issues with his Chinese counterparts. Have Chinese-South Korean relations gotten closer in the six-party talks process? I believe they have, but it hasn't just been South Korean-Chinese relations getting closer. I believe there's been greater coordination among all of the other five members of the six-party talks in dealing with a common problem, which is the North Korean nuclear problem. And as a China specialist, as I said, I've studied China, and as you know, I've studied China most of my adult life. It was quite rewarding intellectually and otherwise to see my boss, Ambassador Hill, dealing with his Chinese counterpart, Vice Foreign Minister Wu Da-wei, in such a robust fashion during the six-party talks process. These are two superb, highly professional diplomats. To see them wrestling with a common problem in such a constructive way in the rounds of the six-party talks in which I had the privilege of participating was a great experience for me. And I think it's a sign of where the U.S.-China relationship how far it has come, and it's a sign of where it can go on these other issues where we have less coordination and we have more challenges. On the six-party talks, is one other thing that I'd like to say is that it's a very ambitious program, the six-party talks. And one of the goals of the six-party talks, aside from the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is the core goal and it's a very important goal, is to help reduce mistrust in the region between the actors. Whether it be Japan and North Korea, the United States and North Korea, the United States and China, we want to have a system in which, by handling the North Korean denuclearization process, we can put to rest some of the very high tensions in the region that flow out of the Cold War and that flow out of World War II, quite frankly, when we deal with China and Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And if the six-party talks can be successful in the denuclearization process, we may be able to move on. One of the working groups in the six-party talks process is a working group on regional security mechanisms moving forward. And we would like to have the six-party talks evolve into something that could reduce tensions in the region moving forward and could become a very big force for understanding among these actors, such as China and South Korea. But I wouldn't limit it to that one bilateral relationship.
Right. This comes from Dave Porter in Portland, Oregon. In a state where less than 2% of college undergraduates and less than 1% of high school students study Mandarin, what would you say to the political leaders of that state, and I would add in the United States, about their educational system? And as a professor of Chinese history, this is...
Well, if people vote with their feet, I voted with my feet. I studied Chinese. I think studying Chinese is a very good thing for American students to do. I know Steve shares this. He studied Chinese as well. It's not always the easiest thing for American students to do, but I think it's a wonderful thing for American students to do. There are some U.S. government programs that encourage local schools to teach Chinese. I think they're very good programs. There are actually some Chinese government programs in the United States to encourage schools to teach Chinese, and we think that those are good programs as well. And it would be good if more Americans understood China, and one way to understand China quite well is to learn the language and to go over there and to converse with people in their original language. And I think it would be very good for the country if more and more students did study Chinese.
Also from Portland, the Chinese seem seriously committed to developing strong trade and diplomatic links with countries in Africa and Latin America, that the U.S. now has marginal ties or even in some cases poor relations. Is the current administration concerned about the inroads that the Chinese are making in these areas?
I think I would rephrase it a bit. It's not so much the inroads that China is making in Latin America and Africa. It's that China sometimes has relationships with governments that we believe are treating their own populations poorly and are often a source for regional instability in the regions in which they exist. And on that score, I think sometimes China's economic relationship in areas of Africa, whether it be Sudan or Zimbabwe, are counterproductive. But in general, and this is important, in general, we believe that China's trade and investment and financial aid programs to Africa, Latin America, et cetera, are good for those regions, they're good for regional stability, and they're good for the world. What we would like China to do is two things. We would like China to coordinate its economic activities in those regions more closely with international organizations that are trying to build good governance and stable economic conditions in those areas than China has in the past. China tends to act on its own on these score. And the second is for China to take into account which governments they're dealing with in these places, so that if you have a situation where Iran is in violation of the demands of the international community, maybe that's not a good time to sign new energy deals and economic deals. If Sudan is supporting genocide in the Darfur region, maybe that's not a good time for an aid package to Bashir's government. In the same in Zimbabwe, and I say maybe in a rhetorical fashion. It's a bad time for it. It's a bad time for it in all these cases that I just listed. But in general, in terms of China's quote-unquote inroads in the third world, we don't view China's inroads in the developing world, I should say, as a zero-sum game in which the United States needs to view China's progress or quote-unquote inroads in a jealous fashion.
Mm-hmm. Not surprisingly, this one comes from Honolulu, from Siegfried Ramier. What are the prospects for a more open policy in issuing visas and encouraging Chinese tourism to the United States? And we've got about 2.5 minutes. So.
Okay. Well, we try to encourage Chinese tourism to the United States. We try to encourage Chinese students to come to the United States, Chinese business people to come to the United States. And we've done quite a good job. There was a lull in visa issuing after 9/11. This was a global phenomenon, and China was affected by it as well. But in the last few years, the issuance of visas have gone up quite sharply to Chinese citizens, and that's something that we're glad about, we're proud of. We believe that it's good for Chinese citizens to come over here and to partake in tourism activities and educational activities, business activities. We think it's good for the United States. We think it's good for China. That being said, there's certain things we have to do to issue a visa, and we have to go through the normal security checks. We have to make sure that the person is who he or she claims to be, et cetera. So there are some requests from the Chinese side that we make it easier for them to get visas, but we can only go so far. We have to follow the U.S. Security laws and make sure that the person who's coming over here should be coming over here. We also have an issue with China in terms of repatriation of citizens who either overstay their visas or come here illegally. And we're working with the Chinese government to try to solve that very real problem in our bilateral relations. And that is an irritant in the process of trying to make it easier for Chinese to come over here.
Well, sitting here with you for this half hour gives me great confidence in the policy. It's wonderful that we have someone who has come from Princeton and is now doing his public service. Of course, being at Princeton is also public service, we know. We have about 45 seconds. Anything, or use 30 of that for last thought?
Yeah, I just want to say again, I think this is a terrific program. I'll look out at the camera so I can see the people out in the United States. I think it's a terrific program. I think it's important for people outside of Washington to engage in these issues in in a detailed and intelligent way. And I think this program provides that sort of opportunity. I just want to thank all the participants around the country, who came out in an evening to talk about U.S.-China relations. So thanks for this opportunity, and thanks for being here.
All right, Tom, thank you so much for being here. Let me thank our speakers who are all over the country and thank our co-hosts who have set up wonderful programs in 30 places. Thanks, and have a wonderful rest of the program.